Welcome to Lesson 2 of Section 7 of the BJCP training program from the Brewers Anonymous Homebrew Club. In this lesson, we are continuing to take a look at the brewing ingredient of water. Specifically, we're going to be discussing removing the chlorine and chloramine in tap water. This is a short lesson, but it is covered in the exam study guide, so it could appear on our exam. So let's get started. Going back to the previous lesson and paraphrasing the idea, if water is good enough to drink, it's good enough to brew. Let's say your tap water at home is pretty good to drink, except for this unmistakable flavor and aroma that reminds you of a swimming pool. Chances are that's from chlorine or chloramine that's added to your water by your municipal water supplier at the source. The addition of chlorine is probably the most known water addition to municipal water supplies. The practice of adding chlorine to water has been used for nearly a century now. It's used as a disinfectant to kill or inactivate microorganisms like bacteria, viruses, and parasites. And doing that helps prevent the spread of waterborne disease. Now, the side effect of it, of course, is that almost bleach-like swimming pool reminiscent aroma and flavor to the water. But we can remove this chlorine from the water before using it to brew our beer and unwittingly adding those distinct chlorine characters to the finished product. If we have the time, the easiest way to remove chlorine from water is to let it sit. The natural process of off-gassing will eventually allow the chlorine to dissipate through the evaporation of the water. This does take some time though. Typically, leaving your brew water sit overnight uncovered is enough time for the chlorine to completely gas off on the homebrew scale of the volume of water that we would typically use. If we're more pressed for time, we can remove the chlorine through boiling the water before we start using it to brew. About 10 minutes usually does the trick. If we go this route to remove the chlorine from our water, we'll need to make sure that it's cooled down enough to use for mashing before we start to prevent from mashing too high. And we'll get into the importance and the effects of temperature in our mash in a later section. It can also be removed with charcoal or active carbon filters. Chances are you may be using one of these already in some way. Refrigerator filters, under sink filters, pitcher filters. These are just some examples of types of active carbon filters. Another additive that may be present in your water that serves many of the same purposes is chloramine. Chloramine is a bit more complex than chlorine. It's a chemical compound as opposed to being the chemical element that chlorine is. This creates a more stable compound than chlorine on its own. And with that increased stability, it lasts far longer than chlorine while performing the same function, disinfecting water and preventing waterborne illness. With chloramine being longer lasting than chlorine, it's a more cost-effective additive and is increasingly becoming more common as the additive of choice to disinfect water. A little bit of a plus side to chloramine is that it adds less flavor and aroma to the water than chlorine, but it still does add that swimming pool-like character to a degree. We can remove chloramine as well, but with its more stable structure and long-lasting presence, off-gassing isn't an option, at least not a practical one. Chloramine needs to be broken down to get that aroma and flavor out of our water. Luckily, there's a fairly simple solution for this. Adding potassium metabisulfite to our water will break down chloramine into its components and dissipate the aroma and flavor character. The amount of potassium metabisulfite is somewhat pre-measured for us in the form of Camden tablets that you can find in virtually any homebrew shop and dozens of places online. One tablet will remove chloramine for 20 gallons of water. You can easily break the tablets apart into halves and quarters and get the appropriate amount for the water you're preparing for brewing. We can also filter through a filter specifically designed to remove chloramine. This is as effective, but much slower than treating all the water at once. It mostly depends on how quickly you want to get this process done. Potassium metabisulfate can treat the water at once. Filtering is limited by the filter's flow rate. So we have one last thing to talk about with the water that we've just removed the chlorine or chloramine from, and that's to note that even stripping these flavors and aromas out, all water still contains a low amount of bacteria. Because of that, we'll want to make sure all the water involved in our brewing will be boiled prior to fermentation. This usually isn't an issue for the mash and strike water because all of that ends up going into the boil. This is more of a side note to keep in mind if you end up having to put any direct water into your fermenter to reach a certain volume. So that brings us to the end of the lesson. Like I said, a short one, but important nonetheless. It could show up on our exam. So let's keep looking at water and head on to lesson 3.